Hello, I'm Tony Parsons, and welcome to the Tony Parsons Show. As a news broadcaster and journalist for the past 50 years, I've reported on the major news events that have shaped our nation. I've interviewed prime ministers, premiers, thought leaders, and other people of distinction from around the world. My goal with this interview series is to help you, my audience, discover the person behind the credentials, while at the same time, I'll invite them to share their professional insights, experiences, and aspirations.
Takes a shot, changeup just missed. Simmons after the puck. Smith shoots, great save, Luongo!
Recognize that voice? My guest today has covered multiple Winter Olympics, NHL All-star games, the Winter Classic, and numerous Stanley Cup finals. A Gemini award winner for his work in television, he also won the 2014 Canadian Screen Award for his play-by-play call of the Stanley Cup final. You're right. That play-by-play call you heard was the undeniable voice of the legendary and one of the most beloved sportscasters in Canada. The voice of Hockey Night in Canada on the CBC and Rogers Sportsnet, Jim Hughson. Jim, you announced your retirement 2 years ago, and you had put in by then 42 years as a broadcaster announcer. And I got to say, you've had quite a career beginning with radio, didn't you?
Yes, absolutely.
You covered the Canucks in the early 1980s before moving east. Then you became the television voice of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I've got to show you something right now.
Oh, makes me want to weep. And if you're going to wear that sweater, I hope you're playing for them, because they tend to pay their high-end talent really well, Tony.
Oh, good. I need that. Yeah. In 86, you joined TSN as the play-by-play announcer for NHL games. And then you covered Major League Baseball.
Correct.
And also that time, the World Junior Championships.
Yeah.
And then you came back in 1995, became the Canucks play-by-play commentator until 2008 when you joined Hockey Night in Canada. All that is well and good, and it looks so good on your bio. But I want to take you back to the very beginning. I know you were born in Dawson Creek, ended up in Fort St. John in British Columbia. Tell us about that. What happened? What was the transition for?
So when I was in high school, I had a wonderful, wonderful English teacher who also ran the drama department. And Jim Hoffman was his name. And Jim became a friend and a mentor. I loved his English classes, but I liked the theater more. And he was kind enough in my last couple of years basically to create a couple of classes in which I was the only student. Writing and directing 12 and acting 11. They were not on a curriculum, but he created them. And I got credit for those courses. And it allowed me to pursue things like I went to elementary schools and worked with kids to put together little plays and events for like the Christmas pageants and things like that. And it also let me work on our high school plays. We were pretty good at it for a little town in the north of British Columbia. We had some great theater presentations, went off to, at the time, they had British Columbia provincial competitions, and we were always there. So that was the area I was leaning. And when I went off to university, I eventually went into the theater department at the University of Victoria. But prior to that, we did some radio plays in high school at the local radio station. And they caught the ear of the manager, who was a friend, because it's a small town at the time, about 6,000 or 8,000 people. And he asked me if I wanted to work part-time at the radio station. I said, sure, needed the extra bucks. So I would work on the weekends. I would, read the news. In a small town radio station at the time, you did absolutely everything. I read the news. I stuffed the carts in the machine for the ads. I would sit and monitor the football games broadcast by Jim Cox and the hockey games broadcast by Jim Robson. And I would monitor them and plug in the local commercials when I had to. So I was working in the radio station. I kind of liked it. When I went off to university, curiously, I found that university didn't pay very well. And so I never did graduate, but I did have an opportunity to go back and work full-time in the radio business. And that's what I chose to do. for $400 a month, I went back to Fort St. John. And so the next thing sequentially that happened, and in small radio stations like that, you get to be a department head, but you have no one else in your department. So the guy who ran the sports department, or was the sports director while I was there, got a better job, moved to Edmonton. As most guys wanted to do, you want to move up to a bigger radio station. He did. So I was left as the only person in the radio station who knew a puck from a football. And so I got to be the sports director, a department of one. And I would broadcast, anything from a local fastball game, anything that the sales department could sell, I would broadcast. It would be a peewee hockey game or a fastball game, or the Fort St. John Flyers senior team that was a real passion of mine and had been, and the Fort St. John junior team that I played for. At the time, I couldn't really broadcast while I was playing, but when I wasn't, I did. So that's how I got started in the business. But when I wanted to move, and I wanted to move it was time for me to get out of town again. I just felt like the North didn't hold it for me, and I wanted to live in a little bigger center and live somewhere further south. And so I didn't care. I applied for jobs, and when I got an offer, I would have worked in the newsroom. I would have worked in sales. I would have done anything. And I got a job in Penticton, broadcasting the V's. And so I moved there, and that's basically where the channeling into the sports department started, because I never really left it after that. I bounced around a little bit. I went up to Kelowna for a couple of years.
I know you were in Kelowna because that's where I live now. Now, I ran across a picture of you and your buddies in Kelowna in the radio station, and this thing on your face, the Fu Manchu.
Yeah, I had a big Fu Manchu mustache. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I must have thought it looked good. I don't know. At the time, I also had hair down on my shoulders at the time too. So
that's right.
There were no razors in my house, and apparently no barbers in the cities that I lived in. So I bounced around. When in Kelowna, I broadcast the Kelowna Buckaroos in the day, and they were a really good team. I took some time off and did the obligatory backpacking trip of Europe, and came back and needed a job. And I went out to Brandon, Manitoba, and worked in a radio station there before I got a chance to move to Vancouver. And that was an interesting call because British Columbians will remember at CKNW, which was the biggest radio station around at the time, the sports director was Tiger Al Davidson, who you will remember.
Remember him well, yes.
I got a phone call while I was in Brandon, Manitoba, and it was Tiger Al, and he offered me a job in Vancouver, and he told me all about it, and I accepted, and didn't have to start for about a month, so I had time to drive out there and go. And it wasn't until halfway across the prairies on my way to Vancouver where I thought, wait a minute, I didn't even ask him what I was going to make. I just accepted the job. And so I arrived at CKNW, and the first question I had for Al after we met and he told me about what I'd be doing was, how much you paying me? And at the time he said, we'll give you $900 a month. And I was overjoyed. It was fantastic. I had never made so much money, and I was still a kid, barely had a change of clothes, driving an old Volkswagen Westphalia, and it kept breaking down. And it was pretty exciting. And not long after that, I got a chance to broadcast some NHL games, and the hook was set.
Yeah, back in those days, there were only 6 teams in the NHL and the AHL.
No, by then the Canucks expanded. So that was up until the '67 expansion. There was only 6 and 6. But I was around. I can't remember. I think there must have been 18 or 20 by that time, or 16 or 20 when because the Canucks were in by then.
Now there are 32.
Yeah.
Do you think that's too many?
I did for a while. When the league expanded a couple of times, even when it expanded, I think to 21. I really thought that the problem was and would be lack of enough talent to be on all of those teams. And for a while it was, but the development systems have worked so well. I don't believe that to be the case anymore. I think that the young players now are better than before. It used to be that teams had one really good line, a second mediocre line, and a couple of lines that you hoped could hang on and not be scored upon until you got back to your first two and a couple of good defensemen. And if they were lucky, they had a good goaltender. It's really changed now. The high-end players are far better. Everybody can skate. Like the third and fourth line guys for a long period of time didn't skate very well, especially the fourth line guys. And coaches were really reluctant to put them on the ice. You can't win now unless you have four lines that can all skate. And the guys on the fourth line may not score very much, but they don't get scored upon as much. And they're not a liability, so they can play for 8 to 10 minutes. So, no, I don't think the talent is diluted, and I don't think it's delusional to suggest that there'll be a couple of more teams within the next 5 or 6 years.
Where do you think they're going to come from?
Well, there's a few candidates. I'd like to think that Quebec City is still in the running, and it's often talked about, but I'm not sure that the NHL and its governors have a real appetite for another team in Canada. I think they're eyeing markets like Houston, like maybe going back to Atlanta for a third time when a new building. It's so much of it is about a couple of things. One is an owner who is really, really rich and committed, and the building, a building that is good for hockey and can make a lot of money. Now, I've gone to Salt Lake, and that building really isn't what they want, but the owner is going to put enough improvements in it to make it an NHL building while they consider building another one for the basketball team and the hockey team. And because of that, that's the kind of owner that I think the NHL wants. And I think it's got a few people around that are interested enough that it will have a choice of a few different cities by the time they're ready to go and expand again.
I'm going to back up again for a minute and throw this name at you. Golden Hawks.
The Fort St. John Golden Hawks. That was my junior team. And regrettably, I played for them one season. They were actually a pretty good team for a while. But what happened in a small northern town was we would lose our best players because I played on a pretty good midget team. And we would have all graduated and gone to play junior together, except 3 or 4 of the best players on our team accepted offers to move south and play in a bigger league and sometimes as big as the Western League because they were good enough. So that left us, didn't leave us very much. So one year I played for the Golden Hawks. It was a 24-game schedule. We were 0-22-1. And I might add, it was the best damn tie in the history of hockey, and I scored the tying goal and the only point we got all season. And that adds up to 23. They didn't make us play the 24th game of the season because it was absolutely meaningless because we hadn't won a game in the first 23. We had some fans. We were really good at parties. And our girlfriends all came to the game, but we were affectionately known in town as the Chicken Hawks. And we were so short of players that our third string goaltender played left wing most nights. That's the kind of team we were. Wouldn't trade it for the world because it was so much fun, but it was a lot of losing, and we knew most nights that we wouldn't win. I would say that they've had considerable success since then at that level.
I played a little hockey myself when I was a kid. We were growing up in Ontario. And my mark on the sport was that I scored on my own goal, and I never lived it down. I was never invited back to play. I don't know why. But so you didn't end up playing professional hockey.
No.
But being around the rink and on the rink, was that the beginning of you becoming a broadcaster and a play-by-play guy?
Well, I think the combination of what I was saying earlier about, I kind of got funneled into the sports department, and that's the area where I was deemed to be good enough to work at the radio stations because I knew the sport, because I played it all the time. And I really had a passion for it. Like in a small town in the days, so you were mentioning, the days of the 6-team NHL and 6-team American League. Mm-hmm. Well, in those days, in the 50s and the early 60s, the senior hockey was at its height. Those were the halcyon days of senior hockey leagues like the South Peace Hockey League that the Fort St. John Flyers belonged to. So because there were so few places to play professionally, they would recruit really good players who'd actually played in the NHL or played in the American League, but they could recruit them to small towns like Fort St. John by getting them a job and giving them an opportunity to basically change careers but still play the game at a reasonably high level. And so the leagues around British Columbia and across Canada were full of guys who had the proverbial cup of coffee at the professional level and were still really good players. And they came in great numbers to Fort St. John. And so the town showed up at the local arena, Fort St. John Memorial Arena. And every town in those days had a memorial arena. Mm-hmm. And they were cold old barns with no artificial ice, but we never missed a game. My parents had season tickets on the blue line. We would sit there with our legs covered in blankets and we would watch, no chicken wire, no glass. And I was mesmerized by the Fort St. John Flyers. The Jimmy Anderson, a right winger in the Southeast Hockey League, is the best player to this day I've ever watched play the game. And that's because against a memory, you don't have a chance. Mm. Those were the words of Peter Zosky when comparing Wayne Gretzky and Gordie Howe. And it holds true to this day. Against a memory, you don't have a chance. And so my memory growing up was of those cold winter nights in the Memorial Arena, watching the Fort St. John Flyers against the Dawson Creek Canucks, and the Grand Prairie Athletics, and the Spirit River Rangers. And it was fantastic. It was a gathering place. The place would be just full of people, Tony. Yeah. Everybody in town was there. At the intermissions, the men would go off to one corner and usually had a flask in their pocket. The women would go off to another corner and have a hot chocolate and talk over the figure skating club, and the men would be talking about the game. And my job was to go out and start the car. Dad would give me the keys, and I'd go out and run the car for the intermission, and so it didn't freeze up, because quite often it'd be 35 below outside while the game was on. And it felt like it was like that in the rink, too. That's why you wore all your winter clothes and covered in a blanket while you were in the rink. But I would sit in the car, and I would listen to Bob Harrison and Bill Dyer, the local radio guy and a local newspaper guy, and they had the hot stove in the intermissions. And I think back, and I think it may have been, too, the start, maybe the seed was planted there, because I listened to their analysis of the game, and I thought, I saw that. That was cool. But I was like 12 years old, so I was a ways from getting into the business. But that was life in small town Fort St. John, in small town Canada at that time. And we had, one channel of television. So the NHL was just something we didn't see. It was no big deal at all.
So eventually you landed the job of doing play-by-play for the Canucks. I'm curious, and so many people are, were you a fan of the team at the time?
Yes, I was, because I worked in the radio station and listened to their games, and they were kind of the local team. But when I went to work there and started broadcasting their games, there was a very different philosophy expected of broadcasters. You needed to have knowledge of the local team, but you needn't be a fan of the local team necessarily. And that was Jim Robson in his greatest days. He was a really unbiased onlooker and reporter of the game. He felt you needed to know the other team. You couldn't ignore the other team. And, you couldn't let your excitement for the game just be dictated by how the home team played, by the Canucks. So I kind of learned from him to do that, and I felt it was the right way to do it. And so carried that through, and it was particularly important when I started doing national broadcasts, because there is a home team, but it wasn't always, the people who were watching weren't always from that town and weren't always fans. So, yeah, at the start, I always wanted the Canucks to do well all the time, because it's so much better in a city when the home team is playing well and has a chance to win, and everybody feels better when their local heroes win. So I always felt that it was great when they won, but I didn't feel like I had to cheer them on.
What's going to happen to them? Are they going to recover from the current slump and maybe win some big-time games?
They look like they're on the right track. Their management seems to have, pressed all the right buttons. I loved some of the things they did with their team last year. And when you look at their lineup, assuming Thatcher Demko will be healthy, and let's hope that he is, they have a great goaltender, and now he's got a really seemingly reliable backup. They have a superstar defenseman, and he's surrounded by some really good, solid journeymen that play alongside him. And they've got a couple of stars up front, especially down the middle. with JT Miller and Elias Pettersson. And so that's the start of a really good team, and they've done a good job of filling around them. I liked some of their signings, especially on defense. So the opportunity is there. The opportunity is there to be a playoff team, and the more experience they get, as they did last spring, that what we've learned is you fail forward in that game, and if you usually take a step back to get forward, and they just about won in the second round. And so they're good enough to get that far again, I think. But there's so many intangibles. That's why you play 82 games in a season, right? And you have to hope you get through that without losing your top players to injury, without hitting any real roadblocks. And so you can never assume that with any team. But if you do assume that, they're as good as a lot of teams in the Western Conference.
Let me just ask you one question. In your mind, who was the GOAT, the greatest of all time? Can you make a selection?
I think you do it. For me, I do it by eras, because as I was mentioning earlier, when Zosky wrote about the boys on the bus, which is Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers and their championship teams, he talked about the comparison between Gretzky and Gordie Howe. And that's where he got the line, or he gave us the line, against a memory, you don't have a chance. So without question, Gordie Howe is one of the greatest plays ever. So is Rocket Richard. So is Jean Beliveau. And I like to group them all together because they never really played against each other. But then there was Gretzky, and then there was Lemieux. And at the same time as Gretzky, there was Brian Trottier. And I remember the great arguments that people would have all the time about Gretzky and Trottier. And Gretzky's not a well-rounded enough player. They didn't use the term 200-foot player in those days, but that's what they meant. And so there's always comparisons. And Bobby Orr needs to be mentioned. So there's players at different positions. They were all great, and I like to lump them. I don't like to pick one or the other, because I just don't think you can compare. I mean, nobody compares yet statistically to Wayne Gretzky, but Alex Ovechkin's going to pass his goal scoring mark in a completely different era, in a game that's played in a completely different fashion. So how do you compare those two? So and the players that are playing the game right now are spectacular. And all of the players that I've mentioned would look at the game today and say, those guys are so much better than we were. And they do. Those that are still around to watch it.
Now, when you're in the booth, I always wonder how you pick out the players the way you do. I mean, they've all got numbers. We know that. But numbers don't necessarily help you out sometimes. You can't see them. So are you looking at skating styles, speed? What do you look at when you look out and see a player and you want to report to the audience, this is who's doing it? What goes on?
So I only speak for myself, but I watched hours and hours of games. So, for example, when I was working Saturdays, it seemed like that was, the only day I went to work. But I spent every other night watching games, 2 games a day. In the old days, I had one of those huge C-band dishes in my backyard, because that's the only way you could get other games. It was off the satellite. And then later we got cable, and we were able to watch the games. So I watched hours and hours of games that I was never broadcasting, but I would center in on, I knew the teams that were coming up on my schedule. I knew who I had to watch on the weekend. So I really watched them closely. When I was doing Canuck games, I watched those guys all the time. And it was numbers and names didn't really matter, because you couldn't see them most of the time anyway. You're right. But you'd look for, if you knew the line combination and you couldn't see who the guy on the right wing was with the puck, you could make an assumption because you knew who his line mates were. And rarely would that go wrong. Most of the time you'd be absolutely right, because the guys would be out there together. There were skating styles. There were helmets. They weren't all robotically the same. There were just, the stride of somebody's skate, or the way they shot the puck, that you would know instantly who it was when they were on the ice. Like Pavel Bure is the perfect example. The moment he stepped on the ice, he was unmistakable. He was so different than everyone else. And there are a number of players who are similar, not to him, but similar to each other, that may be harder to identify. But the top players in particular have always been really easy to pick out of the crowd. But, as lighting got better in the rinks and they did a reasonable job on the numbers, you could usually see who it was that had the puck. Even if if you're troubled a little bit, you could identify, and occasionally you could sneak a peek at a monitor and get a closer look, because one of the worst places to watch a game from is the broadcast booth. You'd never pay for a ticket to watch it from there, because in most arenas it was hanging from the rafters the furthest away from the ice. And so I'd often go back and watch a game that I just broadcast and thought, geez, I can see the game a hell of a lot better here than I could when I was at the rink. And for the most part, I just hoped I was right on any of the guesses that I made.
Then you ended up going to TSN, and that's where baseball comes in. You were a Blue Jays commentator. It's a big crossover.
I started with the Expos. I love baseball. I loved all sports, but there was an opportunity because TSN was still in its fairly new. They hadn't done any Montreal baseball. They'd had Blue Jays for a little while, but the Blue Jay crew was really established at the time, the broadcast crew. So I saw an opportunity to broadcast Expo games, and in my inimitable fashion, I managed to BS my way into that job. I had to do an audition, and I thought I did a reasonable job of it. But I convinced the management, just as I'd convinced Al Davison earlier that I'd be a great hockey broadcaster, so never stopped talking about it. I managed to land the job, and so we didn't do as many hockey games in those days. So I transferred, and we didn't do the full Expo schedule. So I do some hockey games and some baseball games, but I loved the opportunity. The Expos were really good at the time. It was the late '70s. They had terrific players. Rock Raines was still there. The people were really accommodating. Buck Rogers was the manager, and he kind of took me under his wing, and he would answer any questions that I had and help me along. And most of the players on the team were really good. So I spent hours and hours hanging around batting practice and working on and learning how to broadcast a very different game than hockey, because you had to have stories to tell. You had to weave them through the game.
There was a lot more airtime available to you because baseball is such a slower game.
Yeah, it was, and it would meander along for hours. And so you could start a story in the second inning and finish it in the seventh, and in between there'd be a run scored here and a run scored there and a home run here and a home run there and pitching changes and things like that. But the story could stretch out over a long period of time. So I did that for a couple of years. And then TSN decided to make a change on the Toronto crew, and they asked me to move over to broadcast the Blue Jays, which I jumped at that opportunity because it was a little less travel and I could spend nights at home and still work. Everything wasn't on the road. At that time, every hockey game I did and every baseball game I did was on the road. So the opportunity to work at home, and the Blue Jays were a big deal. They were just coming into their own, truly as a championship team. So I still joke with my broadcast partner at the time, Buck Martinez, and some of the guys who were on the crew. So I left and moved back to Vancouver when there was a work stoppage in baseball in 1994, and that's when my baseball days pretty much ended. And I accepted the offer to move back out to Vancouver because Jim Hughson had just retired. But I joke with those guys that in my baseball career with the Blue Jays, I never broadcast a meaningless game, which is quite something in baseball, because oftentimes teams are out by the end of June, or certainly out of it by the end of October, or September or August. But the Blue Jays were so good in those days that they were, there were a couple of those seasons before they won 2 straight World Series where they didn't get eliminated till the final weekend, or they won and got into the playoffs and didn't win the World Series. So every game that I ever broadcast in those days meant something, which is quite incredible over that period of time in baseball. But that's how good a team they were.
You also had time somehow to get involved in video games. Tell me about that.
The video games just sort of came alive in about 94 and 95. But when they started, Tony, they had no room for audio. picture was taking up everything. But one year in 94, I think it was, I got a call from EA Sports that had their campus in Vancouver, in Burnaby. And they asked me if I would be interested in doing some voiceover for them. And I said, sure. And the extent of the audio in the game in the first year was, hello and welcome to United Center in Chicago. And these had all be stitched together. It was really remotely stitched. And tonight's game between the Detroit Red Wings and the Chicago Blackhawks. And that was it. I did that for every building and every team. And there was no room for anything else. That's the only audio that you heard. And the rest of the game would have this cheesy music playing in the background. And, you know, and it wasn't nearly as developed as they are today. But in the second year, EA developed a bandwidth within the game that they had room for audio. They had room for as much as we wanted to do. So I went to work with these young producers, and nobody had ever done this before. Like the soccer game, the big FIFA soccer game, the football games, the baseball games, nobody had ever put audio like this into the games. So nobody knew how to do it. So by trial and error, over a few years period, I think we pretty much perfected the way to do it, but it was the most tedious work you could possibly think of. Sitting in a tiny little phone booth in a basement in Burnaby, reading every National Hockey League player's name in different intonations, because when you said Wayne Gretzky for the first period, it had to be different for Wayne Gretzky in the second period, or Wayne Gretzky in the third period when he scored the winning goal, because the game was different at different times in the game. And the same with all of the little lines like, he passes the puck to, he receives the pass from. Those sorts of little lines. It was hours and hours of tediously reading all of this stuff off. And I would get towards the end of the day and my head would explode. And I'd say, guys, I've got to stop. I just can't do this anymore. My throat's gone and I can't possibly read anymore. But what we successfully did is, over a period of a few years, get those lines to stitch together so they really started to sound like a continuous play-by-play and sentence within the game. So it was actually quite an accomplishment by quite a large team of people. So I was very happy to be involved in that. But after quite a number of years of doing it, when the call came in the springtime to do the next one, I just was so fatigued. I really didn't want to do it anymore. And we could use some things over again from a year before, but there was an awful lot of things, including a lot of names that had to be done. And then we got into the international games. So all the international teams were in there too. And I cringed to think of how I pronounced some of the Russian and Slovak and Czech names back in the day, because we had no pronunciation guide. We had no clue how to say their names and butchered most of them.
Let's get back to the real game. Has the game changed in your mind since you were early days? Is there something about the game that when you started commentating is not there anymore? Do you miss something?
Yeah, it's a bigger business. And because of that, it becomes, it's a bigger deal. And what I would miss, and I preface any comments I make about years gone by with the fact that I never want to be and never will be an old guy that longs for the old days and simply stating facts. It was different. There were different ways of doing things. For example, you could never do some of the things that I did before, starting from, wandering into the coach's office in the middle of the afternoon, sitting down and having a coffee with the assistant coaches in every city and the coaches and swapping ideas. Like I oftentimes wasn't able to see some of the games because not everything was televised in the day. So you counted on, talking to and getting straight answers from coaches and assistant coaches and players. You could establish relationships. I could go into the Canucks room and sit down with somebody and have a conversation one-on-one. And the way that changed is that now the coach, if you know the guy well enough, you might be able to get him aside and get a couple of minutes on your own and ask the odd question. But for the most part, everything is done in media scrums and groups. And same with the players. It's really hard now to do what I used to be able to do, or all of us in that day used to do, was just sit down and have a personal conversation with a player. And in the day, a player might tell you, or a coach might tell you about a player that he's playing through an injury, and you would never go on the air and say, so-and-so's got a bad knee, but it would frame the way you spoke of his game. So you weren't likely to go after a guy for having an awful game when you knew he was playing on one leg. So there was information there that is not available now. And the other thing now is that they make the players available in media scrums as well. So if you do happen to catch somebody one-on-one, then as soon as you ask the first question, there's about 6 other microphones that are in there waiting for the answer, which considerably inhibits the player from answering maybe the way he wants to, but it also keeps you from wanting to ask a question where it might be a touchy subject and you want it to be private because you don't necessarily want to broadcast the answer, but you want to hear what the guy's thought is. So that's one of the biggest differences, and that's just come with time, with social media, with the advancement of the game. So it's a different broadcast world than it was, and I don't say one is better or worse than the other. It's just really different.
I want to throw this out to you for a response. I picked this up off the internet. A story about Bill Hewitt, Foster Hewitt's son, was asked how he felt about, play-by-play guys. And the one thing he said was, they talk too much. Is it? Actually, he mentioned your name. And I don't know whether you knew about that. Is there such a thing as talking too much when you're doing play-by-play?
Yeah, there is. It depends on what you're talking about, I suppose. And I probably, especially in my early years, because I was from the radio business, I would make a real radio call. And as time went by, I started to assume that people could see the game, so didn't need to be told everything. And the game got faster too, so I really had to back off anecdotal little stories that you might tell. And producers and executives really wanted that back in the day. We want you to tell stories about the players. And I would always argue that it's damn near impossible because the game is so fast that as soon as I start talking about some guy's life in Humboldt, then there'd be a goal scored and I'd miss it. Or, talking over a faceoff and things like that. So I really backed off on that. In fact, as the years went by, and one of the questions often asked to me over the years was, what's your favorite call? And one of my favorite calls was the 2012 Stanley Cup final between New Jersey and Los Angeles. And when they got to, I believe it was the 5th game in Los Angeles, and the Kings were up by a couple of goals in the 3rd period, and it was very obvious that they were going to win the Stanley Cup, the first of 2 in 3 years. When the game was no longer in doubt, I hit the callback button to the producer and director and said, "The game's all yours." And with about 3.5 minutes left in the Stanley Cup final, there was not a word from an announcer spoken because nothing more needed to be said. The fans took it home. And for me, that was one of the greatest calls when I didn't say a thing.
That's a good way of putting it. Thank you very much. Now you're retired. What brought on the retirement? You're a young guy.
Yeah, well, I started really young in the business. So I broadcast NHL games in 6 different decades. I broadcast for 42 years in the NHL. Uncle, that was enough. And I was never a guy who was going to work till I was in my 80s. I was never a guy who was going to work forever because I think I've always been a work to live as opposed to a live to work guy. And, I went through a period of time where I missed everything. I was never at home. Everything I did was on the road. My wife, Denise, she ran the taxi service, never missed a thing, and I missed everything. So that was a bit regrettable. I got tired of the travel because I chose to live in Vancouver, which is, from a personal level, a wonderful thing. From at a professional level, it was a long ways from everything. So I tired of getting up to catch planes at 4 o'clock in the morning and make transcontinental flights. And then COVID came along, and I wasn't really thinking about packing it in at that point, but we kind of got a year off. And it's not often you get a year of practice retirement and feel what it was like. And I thought, I kind of like this. And I was pretty good at it. So when they got going again, I just thought, I've had enough. I've accomplished, I've done Stanley Cup finals. And one of the goals that you always have, I certainly had when I got into the business, was like the players, I want to work on the last day of the season. And I was lucky enough to do that for a lot of years. Accomplished that, got to do Olympics, World Cups, things like that. Got to travel a lot, meet wonderful people all across North America. And I just thought, good time. And I remember from people that I really enjoyed, Danny Gallivan and Jim Robson in particular, they left at the top of their game. And I'd like to think that I did too. I still feel like I could have been even better. I could still do the game now. But I thought, let's cut the cord now, and it'll all be on my terms. And I'm happy. And now, having made that decision and gone on with my life, I'm not one to look back. So, and the industry had changed as well. So, and I saw that happening. So the time was right. And to this day, I feel great about it.
Well, you're missed. You were my favorite play-by-play guy, and one of my favorite friends. You're not a great golfer, but I mean, you're.
hey, wait a minute.
Sorry. Well, that's me, not a great golfer, not you. So you have. Go ahead. Sorry.
I can turn any shot off the tee into a 6.
I can do a 7.
That's my game.
So what do you do with your time? You get up in the morning and you have a planned day? You take it easy? You have a hobby?
Not always. Despite the fact that I'm not very good at it, I love to golf. So I try to get some of that in. Try to stay fit. I'm still a runner. I have grandkids, so I spend a lot of time, as much as I can, around them. I like to think, and Denise would answer this better than I suppose, but I like to think that I'm around the house helping out a lot more. Like I'll go out and source all the things we want for a nice dinner, and then I'll make it and I love to spend an afternoon in the kitchen listening to a hockey game or watching a hockey game or usually a sports show on the radio, and putting together a nice dinner. I've got a dog, so he gets more walks than he wants. Sometimes he looks at me like, are we going again? So I always say to my friends that I'm doing absolutely nothing, but I'm really good at it. And so my days seem to be full, and I just enjoy the fact that I'm around my home. I'm just not thinking about the next game anymore. However rewarding it was to work that amount of time, I enjoy the fact that it's in the rearview mirror, and I'm not one to look back or think about the way things were or might have been. Nope, did my best, enjoyed it, worked hard at it, and now I work really hard at filling my days with things that I enjoy, and it could be just about anything. Love to read too.
Good. What do you read?
I'm really big on historical fiction because I love history, but I found that real nonfiction history can sometimes be just dry as week old bread. So I love the fact that there are people around who, I'm just trying to think of the guys I go back to, like Michener, for example, could take history, and if you fact check it, pretty close to the real thing, but bring the characters in history to life. And there's a few favorite authors that I have that do that sort of thing. So historical fiction is probably top of the list, but I run out of things to read because I've read so much of it. And like a good fiction right now. Right now, one of the best books I've ever read in my life was Rohinton Mysteries' story of A Fine Balance, set in India in the 60s, and just so eloquently written that I'm reading it again, and I'll read it again in my life because I liked it so much. But if I've got nothing else to do, I have a real easy time sitting down with a book and reading until I nod off.
Well, is reading, are books something you picked up from your parents?
My mother had a voracious appetite for reading. She was a war bride, and she was actually a proofreader at the local newspaper. So she read a lot there, but she always had books going. We had always had books from my dad was a pocketbook reader. He always had something going as well. So it was always around my house, but it wasn't. Early in my professional career, I didn't feel like I had time. I had young kids, I had a busy schedule, and so I really didn't have time. But as I got a little older, I made the time. I'd sit down on an airplane and never sit down without a book, and find time in a hotel room before bed to sit and read. So I've always enjoyed that, and it just brings me great pleasure to read people and exciting stories and sad stories, emotional stories that are really well written. I think it helps too in the way I would broadcast, because I think I was a little more well-rounded and my vocabulary grew from what I read. That's my story, and I'll stick to it.
Do you have siblings, brothers, sisters?
I have 5 sisters.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh.
4 still alive, all 5 older than I am, which explains my existence, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were going to keep having kids till they had a boy, and I was the youngest. And so, I'm still very, very close with my family. And tragically, one of my sisters passed away some time ago. But that's life as we get a little older.
True enough. We were 6.
It was pretty common back in the day.
Yeah, boys. There was nothing else to do, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not a lot of hockey, 85 years ago when I was born. Anyway, look, my friend, we've sadly come to the end of this. I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you and seeing you again.
To see you again is terrific, even in a Toronto Maple Leafs uniform. And it's been a real pleasure catching up. I hope people enjoy your podcast and find this of some interest, and it doesn't put them to sleep.
Absolutely. You've been terrific. I'll tell you the story about the sweater. When we came to Canada in 1948, I was 9 years old. My mother didn't know a hockey stick from a pogo stick. She was raised as I was on cricket and soccer and things like that. Within 2 years of being in Canada, she became a dyed-in-the-wool Toronto Maple Leafs fan, cheered forever. And her favorite player was Turk Broda.
Isn't that great?
And she loved the game. And I was always amazed that a British woman with no background in sports suddenly cottoned on to this big thing that was such a rage in Canada. So it happened.
My mother was also from Britain, a war bride, and pretty much the same story in the small town and watching the Fort St. John Flyers. And then as TV became part of our household and we had hockey to watch there, she was the same way. Picked it up in no time and had a real passion for it, which was really hard to explain for a young British woman who'd never been out of the country until she moved to Canada.
Yeah. Listen, thanks again, my friend. And I hope we have you back sometime. We'll chat more and longer, and we'll get to golf. We will golf again soon, and we'll have some laughs together. And I've really enjoyed spending this time with you. Thanks very much, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to The Tony Parsons Show, recorded and produced by Mike Peterson at 85 Audio in Kelowna, British Columbia. To learn more about today's guest, please visit our website at thetonyparsonsshow.com. You can reach Tony directly via email at info@thetonyparsonsshow.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, we would greatly appreciate your support. Please consider leaving us a 5-star rating or review on your streaming platform of choice. Join us again next week for a new episode featuring Sandy Ronaldo.